Hi everyone, and thank you so much for coming along to the Student Affairs Group and Coaching Psychology Coaching Psychology Insights into Coaching Psychology talk with Anna Navin Young and Danny McEnery. Sorry about that, I got slightly distracted. So I'm going to ask Anna to start us off.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sinead. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here and spending this time with us. I suppose let me just see if I can. There we go. Just a quick overview of what we want to do, of who I am and what my background is, and we'll kind of go from there. So we'll start off. I'll give a background, how I kind of got into coaching psychology, and Danny will give us a bit of insight into how he came about coming into coaching psychology. And then we'll dive into what is coaching psychology, a brief history of it, looking at some of Danny's master's research, looking at the boundaries between coaching psychology and psychotherapy. And then we really just want to spend a good chunk of tonight answering your questions, seeing what is useful and relevant to you, and just really having a conversation. So if at any point throughout the time that we're talking at you, if you have any questions, I believe we have a Q&A and chat that we can come back to kind of during that Q&A section to really make this as interactive as possible. Okay. So just to give a brief background, I suppose, into who I am and how I came into coaching psychology and what I'm doing with it now today. I have a background in arts, program, and event management. I was doing quite a bit of work with community programs, community services, youth programs, and youth services. A lot to do around building community events such as open mic programs, a lot of kind of theater and performance arts based, a lot of creation of artwork as well. So we would do a lot of work bringing people together to create a story and then to present it in some sort of creative artistic way. So I did a lot of that for a good few years. And when I went to study, I did my undergrad in psychology, and then I did another undergrad in American Studies. And this was a really interdisciplinary program where I could kind of present a proposal for a line of inquiry that I wanted to study and kind of piece together a lot of different modules to create a program for myself. And so within that, I became really interested in time awareness and our relationship with time. So really curious about the ways that we spend our time, think about our time, and value our time, and the impacts that that has from our culture, our society, our family of origin, the communities that we're in, the impacts that our workplaces and our education spaces, our social groups have on the ways that we relate to and experience our time. And so there was a really nice mixing of being able to study that within the interdisciplinary American Studies degree, but then really to position it within psychology. And coming out of the undergrad experience, I was really, I suppose, curious how I could actually apply that work, because I knew it was something, you know, we all have experiences and relationships with time. And I really wanted to be working with people to start to recognize how our time habits impact on our daily decisions, our health and well-being, our work satisfaction, our relationship satisfaction, our sense of self. And that push to find something that could help me to really apply that study beyond just the research is what kind of led me to coaching psychology and realizing that this was a way of really working with the general population in an accessible way, and really specializing in this time awareness and time wellness approach. So I ended up getting a coaching certification qualification in really what I kind of learned to be humanistic and person-centered, and solution-focused coaching, which we'll talk more about in a second here. But after getting that initial qualification, I started my private practice back in 2019, started working with clients on a one-to-one basis, as well as in group programs and workshops with individual groups, with organizations, and so on. But I really wanted to kind of come back to the psychology roots from the undergrad and really just strengthen my own skill set as a practitioner, but also really come back to the research side of things and help to kind of contribute to the time research, but also the integration of coaching psychology within the time research. So I moved to Ireland and I completed the master's in positive and coaching psychology in UCC. From there, it went straight on into a PhD, which hopefully finishing up soon. And I also had the really fantastic opportunity to come back to the master's in positive and coaching psychology. And I've been lecturing on the master's program for the last 4 or 5 years now, and also contributing to the master's in work and organizational psychology. So it's been a bit of a lot going on in terms of maintaining my private practice, working with individuals and organizations as a coaching psychologist, while also continuing as a researcher in coaching psychology and time research, and then lecturing in these areas as well. So I feel very grateful for the array of opportunities that I have. It's just a very brief, quick overview of my background and how I kind of got into coaching psychology, and then I might pass it over to Danny.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you all, and I suppose Sinead and the wider Students Affair group for the invitation here tonight. We're delighted to present as I suppose as part of the special interest group in coaching psychology within Psychological Society of Ireland. So Anna and I are both members of that special interest group. I suppose the Student Affairs group just asked us to give a little background about ourselves. I think you know, as students, a lot of people might be questioning about what direction they're going in their psychology careers, and that's why I suppose we're giving a little detail about what brought us to coaching psychology, and maybe there'll be some questions in regard to that afterwards, or perhaps not. So I suppose just a little background about myself. I was Detective Garda. I was in the Guards for about 13 years. I spent most of my career in plain clothes. I worked in drugs and crime primarily. I finished up as a detective in the Serious Crimes Unit in Anglesey Street inside in Cork City. And I did a lot of personal development work, I suppose, working with a psychologist, and a lot of it was psychotherapeutic, and a lot of it was kind of coaching psychology based. So again, looking at my past and looking at various issues, I suppose, and emotional development, but also looking forward as to what I wanted to achieve in the future. So the help I got, I suppose, was a mixture between psychotherapy and coaching psychology. So I decided to take a different career in life, or a different path. I went back studying. I was very interested in philosophy, phenomenology in particular, which is the study of experience, human experience. And I also set up an equestrian centre in East Cork when I left the Guards. So I completed the Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy in UCC, and then I went on to do the Masters in Positive and Coaching Psychology in UCC. And from there, I suppose, where now at the moment I'm practicing as a coaching psychology practitioner, I'm working in the mental health space. So I'm working with early intervention, what I would say, with adolescents who are experiencing anxiety, and the use of coaching psychology in that space. And I'll give a little bit of background about, you know, when I started practicing within my master's program. I found that a lot of conversations that I was having were in the mental health space, or what I considered were in the mental health space, and I really looked for answers as to where's the boundaries between coaching psychology and psychotherapy. And the boundaries really were drawn as to severity, whereas coaching psychology is suitable for non-clinically significant mental health issues. It was very hard to know as a practitioner how we could implement them in practice. And so my research was in that area, and what I'll talk a little bit about later. Looking into the future, I'm very interested in, I suppose, in mental health, and also very interested in the way the mind works. So I'm completing or I will be starting, I should say, an MA in psychology in UL this September, and that'll convert my philosophy undergraduate into a psychology degree, with a view to potentially taking on a PhD in clinical psychology in the future. I should say, I suppose, that entrepreneurial, I suppose, interest that I developed after I left the Guards has continued. I set up Coaching Psychology Ireland last year, which is a representative organisation for masters and doctorate qualified coaching psychologists and coaching psychology practitioners. And more recently, I've formed Prima Health, which is an organisation for adolescents. It's mental health professionals, occupational therapists, psychotherapists, clinical psychologists who help adolescents who are experiencing anxiety. So that's a little bit about me. I'll maybe pass over to Anna again.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danny. And like we said, this is kind of just a very brief overview on our experiences, and we're gonna kind of jump now into what is coaching psychology and the history of coaching psychology, but we can definitely during the Q&A come back to our personal experiences more if you have questions or want more detail on our experiences. Okay, so I suppose just to give a big, long definition of coaching psychology, which we'll kind of take as a whole, and then we'll break apart into the smaller chunks together. So coaching psychology is a branch of psychology that involves the systematic application of behavioral science to the attainment of professional or personal outcomes that are valued by the coachee. Such outcomes or goals typically focus on the enhancement of personal or professional life experience, work performance, and/or well-being, and can be used for individuals, groups, and/or organizations. Coaching does not aim to treat issues related to mental illness. So let's break that down. So coaching psychology is a branch of psychology. So it's rooted in psychological evidence, psychological research, psychological practice, and it involves the systematic application of that research and practice of behavioral science to the attainment of personal and professional outcomes. So coaching can be used in both a professional context and a workplace context, as well as for individuals and maybe personal or life circumstances. And these personal or professional outcomes are not something that we as the coaching psychologist are determining, but it's really something that is identified as valuable to the coachee, who is the client or the recipient of the coaching psychology service. So these outcomes or these goals are typically focused on the enhancement of personal or professional life experience. So it might be something where I am maybe feeling like I'm struggling in some area of my life, whether that be work related or personal related. And what I'm doing within the coaching psychology space is really putting that focus, putting that accountability and that commitment to really teasing out what's going on for me and how I want to be working towards enhancing or improving that identified area of my life. And this can, like I was saying with my own practice, it can be one-on-one. So a coaching psychologist working with an individual in private sessions. It might be group coaching where there are multiple individuals who are coming into the space together, or it could be within organizations. And we'll kind of go into this final piece at the end here, but coaching psychology does not aim to treat issues related to mental illness. And that, again, is kind of where we're starting to see the boundaries between what is coaching psychology, what is psychotherapy, what is clinical psychology, and where there are a lot of overlaps, but there's also some really important distinctions. Okay, so in terms of where coaching psychology came from, I guess first and foremost, it's an applied psychology. So if we go back to that definition from Tony Grant, who's one of, I suppose, the really big names or one of the founders of coaching psychology and some of the coaching psychology programs in Australia. That idea that it's the application of what we know as psychologists. So from psychological research, from psychological practice, it's applying this into the work that we do with our clients. And it's really focusing on the client as someone who is capable and whole, which can be different from some other schools of thoughts that are really focused on maybe a deficit or a psychopathology, something that's maybe kind of taking up the main focus of the work that we're doing with a client or a patient. This is really focusing on the client in their wholeness, and really focusing in that way on actualizing human potential for those individuals, those groups, or those organizations that we're working with. We can see that as kind of a distinction where coaching psychology can really be focusing on what's going well or what could be going well, what are the strengths that we have, what are the potentials that we have as humans to actualize our potential, to actualize the goals that we have for ourselves, to enhance our well-being, to enhance our performance, to enhance our relationships, and how coaching psychology is the service to really support that enhancement. I would say the main foundations of coaching psychology are really coming from humanistic psychology, which really gained its footing in the latter half of the 20th century. And it's really focused on that person-centered element, seeing the client or the coachee as their own best expert. So based on their life experiences, based on the way that they perceive the world, perceives themselves, it's not us necessarily coming in and telling them what to do, but it's really helping to facilitate a space where they're able to partake in self-reflection, really open up and expand and deepen their self-awareness, and move towards goals that are personally valuable and meaningful to them. Solution focused is really another foundation of it, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second here. But I suppose really that's kind of the pillars of coaching psychology, and where it came from is really just seeing that individual, seeing their potential and believing in their potential, and then developing strategies and approaches from behavioral science and from psychological research to really work towards supporting that enhancement of potential. And what we see as the field of coaching psychology has continued to develop, continue to expand, there's quite a bit of adoption and adaptation of various psychological approaches. So I suppose if we look at the larger field of coaching, there's quite a bit of influence coming from management studies, coming from adult education theory, coming from a lot of different places. But if we're really kind of focused on coaching psychology specifically, there's also quite an array of different psychological approaches that are being used in coaching psychology practice and research, I should say too. And these can be, I suppose, positive psychology is a really big one that's growing quite a bit in the last couple decades. Cognitive behavioral therapy has now been adapted into cognitive behavioral coaching approaches. There's quite a few different narrative approaches that would come from various different psychological backgrounds and are now really being adapted and expanded within the coaching psychology space. And I think it's really important that we recognize the humanistic foundations of coaching psychology, but also really celebrate and appreciate the breadth of approaches that can be used. And I say that because a lot of the recent systematic reviews, meta-analyses of the coaching psychology research are really seeing that an integrative approach is what's most effective for supporting successful coaching outcomes. And when I say the integrated approach, it's really about having these different coaching skills, having these different psychological approaches where we understand maybe some of the strength-based approaches that come from positive psychology. We maybe understand some of the cognitive behavioral approaches from CBT, some of the narrative approaches, and so on. But we're able to, as coaching psychologists, have a breadth of tools in our tool belt. And within individual coaching conversations, within individual coaching relationships, we're able to adapt and really understand when to apply and use different techniques, use different approaches based on how they might be useful for that individual client or that conversation. So I think it speaks a lot to the benefits of the breadth of awareness of different approaches, and really the robustness of building up that coaching psychology practice, and getting familiar with how to apply and how to really be present in a conversation, to bring in these different approaches as they're appropriate. Okay, so I've mentioned these words probably a couple times in those last couple minutes, but I really want to emphasize them as some of the core principles of coaching psychology. So facilitation is the main one. We, in a recent review in 2019, some of the authors really are focused on the role of the coach, and how it's not to guide the client, it's not to direct the client, it's not to instruct the client, but rather it's to facilitate the space. And that facilitation is really about facilitating reflection, facilitating self-awareness, facilitating the ability to kind of identify what are my goals for this? What do I want to achieve? Where do I want to try to enhance a certain area of my life? Something that I really want to work on improving. So identifying what's important to me as a client, and then what are the steps that I can take to get there and to move forward. And it's not then, in that sense, me as a coaching psychologist instructing them how to get there or what their goal should be, but it's really helping to facilitate that space of goal identification and pursuit through the self-awareness and reflection. And then the other core principle that I want to bring up is the really, really important key feature of the coach-client relationship. And we see this across really all care professions, but the working alliance theory is really one of the most successful ingredients in any type of care profession in actually leading to successful outcomes. And that is really just, we have what's called the working alliance theory. It's also been adapted for coaching psychology as the coaching alliance theory. And that's just looking at the relationship that the coach and the client are developing, and how that in itself, creating a safe, trusting environment and relationship, is helping them to move towards the goals and the outcomes that the client is identifying for themselves. So that's going really back to that person-centered approach, where we want to see the client as somebody who's capable, who has a lot of potential, who can really contribute to the coaching space with us as the practitioners. They're the expert in their own lives, so we're trying to get really curious about what their perspective is. How do we understand it? How do we ask the questions? How do we hold space and listen with them to really move forward in a way that's going to be useful at their pace? And so in this way, coaching psychology is really seen as a co-created space, where it's the coach and the client co-creating the relationship, but it's also the coach and the client constantly creating each conversation that they're having. And in that way, we usually say the client is the one who sets the agenda. So the coach isn't coming in and saying, here's what we're going to talk about today, or here's what we're going to do, here's the goal that we're going to work on. It's really focused on the client coming in and saying, this is what's important to me today. This is what's going to be useful coming out of this conversation, and allowing them to guide us at their pace and with the topics that are important to them. So I think it's important in some ways, in talking about what coaching psychology is, to consider what it isn't, or some of the ways that we can compare it to other well-known or well-understood practices. And so what I want to do is just take a look here at coaching psychology, mentoring, consulting or training, and then therapy and counseling. And what are some of the similarities? What are some of the differences? So if we start off at the top here, solution focused. So we can see coaching and mentoring as two solution focused relationships that we might get into. The difference between them, so the solution focus, I should say, is how are we focusing on moving forward, overcoming obstacles, really understanding and giving space for the strengths that we have, for the values that we have, for the potential that we have in our lives, and looking at where am I now in terms of that potential, in terms of that goal, in terms of that thing that's meaningful for me, and how are we working towards enhancing that even more or improving that even more. So really focused on guiding us towards solutions in that enhancement potential space. The mentoring, however, is much more focused on an instruction-based relationship, where typically the mentor is somebody, so say, for example, we have somebody, a mentee, who's coming to somebody who has 20 years experience in the job that they, or the career that the mentee wants to pursue. So the mentor in this case has similar experience and is able to instruct, to give advice, to maybe help to guide or tell the mentee from their experience some of the options that they have, some of the ways that they could move forward, some of the ways that they could make decisions, handle situations, and so on. So it's really coming from the mentor's experience and approach rather than from the mentee's positioning. And that's where, if we move to the other side, coaching is much more focused on the facilitation, like we were saying before. So rather than the coaching psychologist coming with whatever experience it is that they have, focusing instead on what is the client's potential for coming up with their own solutions, and how is the coaching psychologist really there as a thinking partner to help to facilitate that reflection, that self-awareness, to really kind of weigh different options that the client is bringing into the situation. So it's not about the coaching psychologist's experiences. It's not about the coaching psychologist giving advice or instructing the client on what to do. It's really about holding that space, creating that trusting relationship where we can be thinking partners together to work towards the solutions that the client is bringing to the coaching space. If we move then down to the other end of the spectrum, so we have solution focused, but we also have problem focused professions. And that would be much more focused on there's some sort of obstacle, maybe some sort of deficit in knowledge. And we're really trying to focus on that. So we're really focused on the problem and working through the problem rather than working into the solutions. Training and consulting is an example of this, where we might be brought into an organization to do some sort of consulting or some sort of training on maybe a skill set that there's a deficit in, or maybe some sort of problem that the organization is facing. And our role as consultant is to really focus on that problem and how do we work with that problem. This is also coming from an instruction-based perspective, where it's really the consultant or the trainer coming in with a level of knowledge, a level of expertise that they are then applying to that problem and to addressing that problem. Therapy and counseling can also be seen as a problem-focused approach, where it's again focusing on some sort of challenge or some sort of problem that is arising for the client, rather than instructing. The therapist is maybe facilitating that space, similar to a coaching psychologist. But it's still much more focused on maybe healing, working through that problem focused space, as opposed to the coaching psychology, which is moving towards that solution focused space. And that is where I would like to kind of pause for a second and hand it over to Danny, because as Danny was saying before, he got really kind of interested in what is this difference and what are the potential boundaries between a coaching psychology space and a psychotherapy space, where they are very similar in a lot of ways, but how do we make important distinctions, and how do we as practitioners need to know where those boundaries might lie? So I want to pass it over to Danny so he can really kind of tease this out a bit more with us.
Thank you very much, Anna. So as I mentioned briefly earlier, I've a small private practice, and I work using coaching psychology for adolescents who are experiencing anxiety. So the two approaches I take to coaching psychology are that humanistic approach and also a cognitive behavioral approach. So it was in my master's in applied psychology in UCC that I realized some of the conversations I was having, coaching psychology conversations that I was having, people were presenting with what might be considered low mood, or they were anxious in themselves about social situations. But where is the boundary between low mood and depression? And I think really when we're taking that humanistic approach to our practice, that humanistic approach looks at the individual as being whole. But it's very important also that we also realize where the limits of our expertise is and where coaching psychology is suitable for and where it's not suitable for. So people can be very unwell, and it's very important that that they get the right help, and people are very vulnerable when they have mental health issues. So I started researching, I suppose, how we can understand the boundaries between coaching psychology and psychotherapy. And this led me to my research project, which was a qualitative research project. My supervisor was Professor John McCarthy in UCC, for anyone who knows Professor McCarthy. So just to give you, I'm not going to go into detail here, but just to give some of those who might be interested in it an orientation, my methodology was a descriptive psychological phenomenological methodology. And I was looking to try to elucidate the intuitive experience of healthcare professionals. So I interviewed GPs, clinical psychologists, psychotherapists, and coaching psychologists, all different professionals that are in the healthcare space that have to try to decipher between what might be a severe mental health issue or a less severe mental health issue. Because I suppose we understand coaching psychology can and is used for mental health issues that are non-clinically significant or not so severe, but it's not suitable for clinically significant mental health issues. But it's for a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist to draw that distinction. And so as practitioners, how do we, in the coaching space, understand where that boundary lies? So we weren't looking for a definitive. It's not our job to actually say somebody has a clinically significant mental health issue, but as coaches, how can we be aware of where these boundaries in and around lie? So we might say, do you know what, this needs to go to a different professional, and this client may be better suited with a different professional. Thanks, Anna. So just to touch back a little bit about what Anna spoke about earlier, if we look at coaching psychology and psychotherapy, Anna drove it out there, and it's very easy for us to put coaching psychology here and psychotherapy there, and it's very important to do that in terms of that we get an orientation. But in practice, and really when you're holding space for a client, what you'll often find is those boundaries can blur, and they are blurred. And I don't think we should look at these lines as definitive. They always probably will blur, but I think it's very important that we understand where those lines might be, and we have an understanding as professionals, I suppose, where those lines might be. So if you look at coaching psychology and psychotherapy, they're both conversational practices. As Anna spoke about earlier, they're both looking for change, whether it's somebody to overcome a trauma, and maybe a childhood trauma, or whether it's looking for someone to change something going on in their life at the moment. Maybe they're feeling anxious in a social situation, and they want to unpack what's happening there. And so trust, listening, and questioning is hugely important in both a coaching psychology and psychotherapy relationship. Thanks, Anna. So for today, how can we distinguish between coaching psychology and psychotherapy? And one of the oftentimes the difference given is time orientation. So coaching psychology is often future focused. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of coaching practices are goal orientated. So you're looking at a goal. What do you want to achieve? And that's putting the person already into the future and saying, what do I want to achieve here? Whereas psychotherapy are oftentimes focused on the past. It's past issues, past traumas. And now, in saying that, I think anyone who's a psychotherapist will say that's not always the case. And I think anyone who's working in the coaching psychology space will say that's not always the case. But we're trying to draw out a distinction here to try to get an orientation of the difference. So certainly psychotherapists will look at goals and look at someone's current life or where they're moving towards. And equally in coaching psychology, you will have issues in the past coming up that are relevant to the present. But I suppose why is in coaching psychology we acknowledge and we appreciate those past issues or traumas. We don't delve into them in detail. And we would expect someone to be coming out of those issues and not dwelling on those issues in a coaching psychology conversation. And so a difference again between coaching psychology and psychotherapy that has been drawn since the early days of the formation of coaching psychology as an applied psychology discipline was a mental health boundary. And whilst by and large there's a consensus that coaching psychology isn't suitable for clinically significant mental health issues. Thanks, Anna. So I suppose the question then arises is, as coaching psychology practitioners, how can we identify what is and what is not a clinically significant mental health issue? And when I looked at the research in that area, some papers had been published on it and there were more expert opinions rather than empirical research. There had been no empirical research into this area. And so I set about undertaking this research project. I interviewed 17 participants. There was almost 800 hours of 800 minutes, I should say, of data gathered, and a thematic analysis was conducted of that data afterwards. Now there was 10 different themes that emerged, but I'm just going to present 4 to you here today. And these 4 themes are indicators of how we might, as coaches, understand when an issue, a mental health issue, may be a clinically significant mental health issue. So it may be a severe mental health issue that is beyond the scope of where coaching psychology can help. So the first indicator of a clinically significant mental health issue is the management of the mental health issue. And that's how the client is actually managing in their day-to-day with that mental health issue. So are they managing to get to school? Are they managing to get to work? So oftentimes what you'll see is when a mental health issue is getting worse, that the person, let's say in the adolescents I work with, certainly an indicator for me will be if they're not able to get to school because they're so worried, let's say with anxiety, they're so worried about that anxiety that they're not actually able to get into school. So, and sorry, I'm just after seeing here, the numbers aren't correct on that slide, my apologies. So the second indicator of a clinically significant mental health issue is the context of the mental health issue. So what is context? We use context, but we might say cause. So what's actually causing that mental health issue? Is it a trauma that has happened? Is it, is it more fixed? Is it something like biological? Has the person always experienced the world in that way? Or then maybe it's a way of thinking, a pattern of thinking that needs to be thought through, and that's a real coaching psychology type conversation, and in fact quite closely aligned with cognitive behavioral approaches to therapeutic conversations. So you're really trying to unpack what are the beliefs, what are the assumptions that's going on behind the scenes, and I suppose driving the behavior of the client. So the third indicator is awareness of context. So then somebody might come into a coaching conversation and they might say, I'm feeling anxious about doing a presentation in school. They're very clear what that anxiety is about. And whereas, sometimes a client mightn't be aware at all of the context of their mental health issue. They might say, I'm feeling anxious and I have no idea what's happening. And that leads us on to the fourth indicator of a clinically significant mental health issue, which is progression. So oftentimes, in fact, what you find in coaching psychology conversations and indeed in psychotherapy conversations are that awareness of the context isn't always present for the client, but you would expect to see progress in that regard. So you would be expecting for someone to start becoming aware of what's going on for them. You would be expecting that anxiety is starting to begin to become less and less as the conversation is going forward. And I suppose if it's not, if somebody has low mood and they're continuously having low mood, and really that it doesn't seem to be overcoming that, then I suppose not definitively, but working in the coaching psychology space, we really should be talking to our supervisors and looking for advice as to whether we are the best practitioner to help this client at the moment. And as I say, I think it's very important to draw those boundaries between coaching psychology and psychotherapy, in particularly in the mental health space. And I see there's a question in there from Leanne that is very relevant to this. You know, there is a lot of people who present, you know, in many different forms, including coaching, and they mightn't have the training or qualifications necessary to help individuals. And that, you know, people, when they're looking for help, they're vulnerable. And it's very important that we set those boundaries and we understand where the boundaries of our practices are. So that's a whistle stop tour of my research. Thanks, Anna. And we'll now take any questions. You know, we'd like to hear what you might be interested in, what areas you might be interested in. I know Leanne has a question in there that maybe I might respond to. But any other questions, please do feel free to send them on to the chat.
Thank you very much, Anna and Danny, for two really interesting presentations on counselling psychology. Coaching psychology, too many C's. So yeah, we do have 3 questions actually. I think you've already partially answered Leanne's there, Danny. I don't know if either of you want to go a little bit further into that. So Leanne asked, how do you guard against misinformation, health optimization, and other problematic issues that seem to have infiltrated this sector with the influencer coach or non-expert coach? Is there anything further you'd like to add to what you already said?
It's I suppose just highlighting what you're saying, it very much is a problem, Leanne. It seems to be more of a problem than is in the therapy space. So whilst, you know, those a therapist, psychologist, they aren't, those terms aren't protected as of yet, nor is coaching. And you have a lot of people who are saying they're coaches. And I suppose I always use the term coaching psychology because I'm very much trying to differentiate it in that. And I think we should acknowledge that coaching psychology is a relatively new discipline. You know, it was the foundation of the applied psychology unit in Sydney University in 2000. So we're kind of in around, you know, at 2 decades of development here. So it is a relatively new discipline when we compare it to psychotherapy, but certainly it's a problem. And I suppose representative organizations will probably take care of that, possibly CORU. There isn't a mention yet of CORU, including coaching, I suppose, in their what would I say, in what they're doing at the moment with psychotherapy and psychologists trying to amalgamate what is considered a psychotherapist and what isn't considered a psychotherapist.
Thanks very much. Yeah, well, I think we're all looking forward to the CORU regulations coming in to protect those titles, but it would be good to see that expand a little bit more, perhaps. Okay, so the next question is there any books you would recommend on coaching psychology?
That is a great question. I think there are a lot out there. So one of the ones that I like to go to is the Introduction to Coaching Psychology, which I think the most recent edition was 2021, and that's edited by Stephen Palmer and Siobhan O'Riordan in the UK. They also run the International Society of Coaching Psychology, which is a great resource. So that's definitely one that just gives a very nice breadth of information in terms of a lot of the foundations. Speaking to a lot of what we kind of covered today in terms of what are some of the humanistic approaches and humanistic foundations, what are some of the more cognitive behavioral narrative approaches, positive psychology approaches, and then how are we addressing some of the challenges of growing in the discipline. I think there's also quite a few by some of the other, I suppose, large names in the field of coaching psychology. So Susie Green, Anthony Grant. I don't necessarily have the titles off the top of my head, and I apologize for that. But definitely, I would go back to what Danny has kind of distinguished there, where we do have a lot of coaching material out there. And one of the distinctions that can be really important is coaching versus coaching psychology. So if we're looking at, doing a Google search, I might recommend that Googling coaching psychology could help to find some of those resources that are really looking at the psychological foundations of the practice. And that's not to say I definitely will draw on other coaching related resources as well. And I think there's a lot of benefit to them, but they might be more founded in management studies, adult education, and some of the other influences that we see within the larger coaching industry.
Thank you very much, Anna. So our next question is, okay, so if I'm a chartered work and organizational psychologist and have qualifications in executive coaching, do I need to do further studies in coaching psychology to call myself a coaching psychologist? If so, what further studies or courses would you recommend for coaching psychologists? And thank you both for your time this evening and the excellent content.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you again for being here and for these questions. It's really great to see what's coming up for everybody. And this is a very tricky question, and it's definitely something when I'm teaching the students in the master's program in UCC, there's a lot of questions that come up of, well, there's all sorts of different trainings and there's different ways that I could specialize as a coach. There are certain approaches that I could do additional trainings to specialize in. And I think the answer is often it depends, and it depends on the type of work that you want to be doing, the types of clients that you want to be servicing, and in terms of what skill sets, what backgrounds, what qualifications do you need in order to do that work and to do it well. So being a chartered work and organizational psychologist means that there's a whole slew of information and qualifications and skill sets that you would have in terms of the work that you do. And having that executive coaching as well means that there's a lot of skill sets that you're bringing to the table as well. When it comes to coaching psychology, being a self-regulated or unregulated market, there's nothing to say at the moment that somebody can or can't call themselves a coaching psychologist. Right now, there really isn't that regulation. And that's where it really comes back to that self-regulation in terms of what integrity do we have in terms of taking on different titles. So I think in terms of further education, again, it really goes back to what's important to you in the type of work that you want to be doing, the types of clients that you want to be working with. But the bias, but the master's program down in UCC does have that master's level qualification in positive psychology and coaching psychology training. And again, I think that would really be what I'd be looking at, is the coaching psychology component of any further education that you might be looking for. There's a number of master's level programs in the UK as well as in Australia. So I'd be happy to kind of talk on a more individual level, but I think it really does depend.
Thank you very much, Anna. So next question, leading on slightly from what you just said, is there anywhere other than UCC that does the Masters in Coaching Psychology?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my understanding is, and I could be very wrong, so please anybody correct me. But my understanding is that is really the primary option available in Ireland at the moment. There are other coaching related programs in Ireland, but maybe not necessarily focused on coaching psychology. So they might be more situated within a business department or something like that. There are a few in the UK, like I said, that are focused on positive psychology and or positive psychology and coaching psychology. We see, I suppose, the development of coaching in the United States is much more situated within business and management. So they wouldn't necessarily be programs in coaching psychology to my awareness, but it would be much more coaching for management, or again, situated oftentimes in management and business schools. Very much speaking to kind of my limited knowledge. So again, please feel free to correct me if there are other programs out there that I'm not thinking of in the moment. Danny, are you aware of any others that I'm not mentioning?
No, I think that's there's just Dermot O'Neill said Southeast Technological University runs Masters in Executive Coaching and 2 other Masters program in coaching.
Okay.
So I wasn't aware of that myself.
Yeah, and UCC also has a another master's program in personal and management coaching, which again, it takes in some level from the psychological background, but it's also coming from more of that management approach. And we do see, I guess, in general, that coaching is a very fast growing industry globally. There's quite a bit of growth that's been happening over the last couple of decades. So with that, there's a lot more options in terms of training, in terms of further education. So I think it's really about kind of doing your research and considering for yourself what you'd be looking for out of an education experience and what you might be looking for in terms of what that's moving you towards in terms of career, in terms of who you might like to be working with.
Thank you very much again, Anna. So our next question is, where does coaching psychology fit into post-primary referral procedures for students? And can relevant school personnel refer, or is it on a private self-referral basis or through a GP?
Might you repeat the question again, please, Sinead?
Sorry, it was, where does coaching psychology fit into post-primary referral procedures for students? And can relevant school personnel refer, or is it on a private self-referral basis or through a GP? So can it be referred through school personnel or through private or through a GP?
Yeah, I would say there's, it really depends. Where coaching psychology in different contexts, in different organizations, in different academic settings is recognized or not recognized at various different levels. It being a newer discipline and it being something that's not necessarily as widely understood or known as a potential service. So I think that there is maybe yet to be a standard practice in terms of where the referrals are coming from and what that looks like in different contexts. I think there's quite a bit that can happen when the awareness of that is there, that it's a potential option. That can come from personal referral. It can come from personal contact and reaching out to the coaching psychologist. It can come from a professional referral, but there is quite a bit, I suppose, in the standard practices at the moment where it really is the client who would need to be kind of agreeing to the coaching, and there would definitely be kind of that level that would need to be happening. So I would say it's definitely something that's kind of in its infant stages of being established within the larger referral network.
Okay, that's brilliant, thank you. And there is a recommendation of a book here, just to see what you two think about it. It's The Handbook of Coaching Psychology, a Guide for Practitioners, 2nd edition, Palmer, and I think that's Wybrow, published around 2019.
Yeah,
and John says it's a very good resource.
Fantastic. Yeah, I would definitely, again, Stephen Palmer and Alison Wybrow there are both very well-known coaching psychologists in the UK. Unfortunately, Alison passed away a number of years ago, but they've done substantial amount of research and publications in the field.
So we're just coming up to 9 o'clock. Is there any last questions before we let our two fantastic panelists go and enjoy the rest of their evening? Yes, there is. Okay, how is coaching psychology articulated in organizations? For example, in a company context, is it through HR? And thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. So there's what we would consider internal coaches as well as then external coaches. So internal coaches would be oftentimes situated within HR, learning and development teams who are employed by the company to deliver that type of coaching related service within the employees and the teams in the company. Depending on the industry, depending on the organization, there's kind of various levels of those types of roles that are currently available. It might be that there's a lot more HR staff, a lot more managers and leadership staff who are being trained in coaching skills and then are applying that kind of within their current positions. But then in some companies, there are those internal coaching roles as well. But then what we also see is that there's quite a bit of external coaches who are contracted to come in and deliver those coaching services within the organization. And that might happen at an individual level. So maybe there's an executive, maybe there's a manager or a leader or an employee who is seeking that coaching psychology service. And then the organization is contracting that coaching psychologist to come in and work with them. And it's an interesting relationship then in terms of the coaching psychologist having that relationship with the organization, also having that relationship with the individual coachee or the employee, and kind of navigating what are the organization's goals for the coaching, but also really staying grounded in what is the benefit for the employee. And often those types of coming in as an external consultant would be performance based. So it's a lot of what are some of these ways in which we can look at enhancing our performance as employees, as leaders, as managers. But what I find interesting in some of the work that I'm being contracted for is there's a lot more, whether underlying or very direct, focus on well-being as well, because we see a lot more in terms of workplace well-being coming more and more into focus. So there's a lot more coaching that's coming in that's looking at how do we enhance well-being in the workplace as well. So I suppose the context can really vary. I hope that's kind of answering the question there.
Yeah, that is a great answer. Thank you so much, Anna. So it is just 9 o'clock. So I am going to say thank you to everyone for coming along, and particular thanks to Anna, Navin and Danny McEnery for being our brilliant panelists tonight and telling us loads about coaching psychology. I know that for me, it was a really huge learning experience, and I'm sure for all the other students and people who aren't students who wanted to know more, it was really enjoyable and very, very informative. So thank you so much and have a lovely evening.
Thank you too,
Bye.
Sinead.
Thank you.
No.
Have a great evening.